Anxiety Health Clinic in Washington, D.C. He's also the co-chair and also the founder of the National Social Anxiety Center, along with Lauren Newman is the co-chair. So I'm going to just let Larry get started, and please hold your questions until he asks for them. Thank you, Larry.
Thank you, Celeste. And this is being recorded. Vicki, is that right? Is the recording? It is happening now. So everyone should realize that if you decide to speak, you and your voice and your image will be part of the recording. But feel free to ask me questions whenever you wish. This workshop, this presentation is going to be about social anxiety and social trauma. I stress social trauma, not physical, violent, or sexual trauma. It is not a discussion of post-traumatic stress disorder or acute stress disorder. The DSM, as you know, defines trauma for those disorders as something that involves death or threatened death or serious injury or sexual assault. We're not talking about that today. We're talking about social trauma and its relationship with social anxiety, as well as a couple cognitive behavioral strategies to deal with that. And by social trauma, I mean an experience that is in some way humiliating, some way shaming to the person. And it usually involves harsh ridicule, harsh criticism, maybe rejection. This work comes from David M. Clark. I do need to say there are multiple David Clarks in the CBT world. The David Clark I'm speaking about today is the English one with Oxford University, David M. Clark. And he has some important resources on that that we shared with you and will be linked on the website as well. His premise is that most people, he would say nearly everybody, with social anxiety has some sort of image or at least strong impression of how they come across when they are anxious. And that these negative images or negative impressions stem from earlier socially traumatic experiences that they've had, typically in childhood or adolescence, but it could happen later in life as well, but for the majority of people, by adolescence. In other words, experiences of social trauma in childhood or adolescence or whenever create negative self-images of how we think we come across, and those self-images create what we call core beliefs, underlying attitudes we have about ourselves and about how others react to us. And this is important because these images affect the way socially anxious people perceive themselves in the present. They aren't just haunting images, but they affect the way a socially anxious person sees him or herself when they are in a situation in the present in which their anxiety is triggered. Clark would stress that these images and the core beliefs that these images encapsulate affect the way socially anxious people perceive themselves, as I said. They tend to take their images as evidence of how we're coming across, as opposed to looking at the actual evidence of how people are reacting to us. Socially anxious people are adopting their own images of themselves as evidence of how they are coming across. So if their image is that others are laughing at them because they've appeared anxious to others, or if their image are that others are criticizing or thinking negatively of them because they in some way made errors or made a bad impression, images that come from social trauma in the past, then they're likely to see a present day interaction in light of those images, even if the actual external evidence in the moment is rather positive, they're likely to see it negatively. The imagery of social trauma affects how they see things presently. Because of that, David Clark's model of CBT for social anxiety stresses not only the usual stuff that all CBT models stress, which is exposure. He would rather call it experiments. So it's not just exposure to bring about habituation of anxiety, but it's experiments to test our disturbing thoughts, as well as disturbing core beliefs about how we come across. So he stresses all of that, which other models, CBT models of social anxiety work, stress as well. But unlike other earlier models by Hoffman or Heimberg and others, he stresses the importance of getting at changing underlying imagery and the core beliefs associated with imagery. Earlier models of CBT for social anxiety frankly treated social anxiety as just another phobia, where core belief work wasn't necessary, as it is rarely necessary with other phobias. But Clark emphasizes that with social anxiety, underlying core beliefs and the imageries connected with those core beliefs are a big part of the maintaining mechanism of social anxiety. As I said, they affect the way we feel we come across in the present. They also lead to a negative bias. We pay much more attention to what looks like negative evidence rather than the positive evidence of what is actually going on. And also these negative images and negative core beliefs with social anxiety lead to, for many people, much worry about upcoming social interactions or other kinds of performance situations, much worry ahead of time, and much post-event rumination, where people could spend hours, maybe years, not constantly, but years, ruminating about upsetting experiences and how they felt they didn't handle it well. So David Clark believes, and I would certainly agree from my work, that underlying core beliefs and the images that go with them are an important maintaining factor with social anxiety. He stresses two strategies to work with changing the imagery and core beliefs that underlie social anxiety. The first one, which technically is called stimulus discrimination training, but the more user-friendly name is then versus now, which I prefer to use, is the thing that he uses with nearly everybody. The second technique, which I will also describe later, imagery rescripting, is used more with people that have a harder time making progress. Now, before I describe these techniques, I want to stress these are not the initial interventions. The initial interventions are doing experiments. Actually, the very first intervention is training of attention. We would call it external mindfulness training. He just calls it attention training. It's not about meditation. It's about helping a client learn how to focus externally on what is actually happening, what he or she is seeing and hearing, as opposed to thinking and feeling, as well as doing a series of experiments, exposures, to test out their socially anxious hot thoughts and underlying beliefs. It's important that the mindfulness training, external mindfulness, attention training, and experiments happen before the social trauma work. Because as you'll see, the social trauma work depends on using evidence already gathered in therapy to challenge the old core beliefs. So it's important that they will have already gathered much positive evidence before you start delving into this work. So typically that means you wouldn't begin the stimulus discrimination training or the imagery rescripting, the social trauma work with socially anxious people until after a couple months or at least several weeks of work, depending how rapidly they are making progress in gathering positive evidence, refuting their anxious hot thoughts and core beliefs. The then versus now technique, or stimulus discrimination training, involves a few steps. The first step is asking the client, what is the recurrent image or impression they have about how they come across in situations in which they are feeling socially anxious? An important aside that I want to stress is David Clark emphasizes with some people this is very vivid visual images. They're seeing pictures in their mind that are emotionally laden, but not with everybody. With some people, imagery is vaguer than that. They're not seeing pictures, or the pictures are rather vague, but they still have very strong, he uses the word, impressions of how they come across. I stress that because if you ask somebody about their imagery, they may answer honestly, I don't see any pictures in my mind. But then if you ask them the follow-up question, what's the impression you have of how you come across, they're very likely to have an answer to that. So again, the first step in stimulus discrimination training, or I'll just call it from now on, then versus now, asking the client, what's the impression you have about how you come across when you are socially anxious? And they might say, I see myself appearing really red or sweaty, or that I'm jittering and that my speech is very awkward and halting. And then you would also ask them, what's your impression or image of how others are reacting to you? And they might say something like, I imagine that people are laughing, or at least on the inside they're laughing at me, even if they're too polite to laugh out loud. I imagine they're thinking of me as very odd, very weird, and feeling negative things toward me. Then you would ask the person, what's the first time you remember feeling this way? What's the first experience you've had in which you felt this way, in which you experienced this happening? Now, some people can readily answer that. Other people have a harder time, and so it's not necessary that they come to what is absolutely the very first instance. You could just ask them, what's the earliest one that you remember? That'll be good enough for our purposes. And then with their eyes closed, you would ask them to describe that situation in detail. Even somebody that doesn't experience much visual imagery, they don't have vivid pictures going through their mind, can still narrate the scene, almost like the author of a book might narrate the scene. And I would ask them to do that in first person and in present tense. So I am in my 7th grade gym class, and I am remembering, not imagining, sorry, appearing awkward when playing basketball. This is getting a little personal. Anyways, appearing awkward when playing basketball, and other people talking about me and looking at me with a scornful look and criticizing me, and a couple people making very negative comments toward me and others laughing. Let's say that's the image, or it might be a very different image. You would ask the client to describe the image in as vivid a detail as they can, that they are either seeing in their mind's eye or that they can describe through narration. So again, the first step is they're describing their recurrent image in the present that they experience when they are socially anxious now. And then the next step is they're describing their earliest remembered experience of that image occurring. In other words, the social trauma that they experienced. And then you would, of course, ask them how it felt for you. They may be experiencing those feelings now if the imagery is quite vivid for them, or it may be more of a remembered feeling, but they're likely to be able to answer and say things typically like it felt horribly embarrassing, humiliating, and shaming. An aside that I want to mention, social anxiety, although clearly is an anxiety disorder, it's also a disorder based on shame for the large majority of people with social anxiety disorder. There are some people with social anxiety, but there are actually a small minority who are simply experiencing a specific phobia about some sort of social interaction, maybe public speaking, maybe eating or writing in front of others. And although those are common social anxiety triggers, it's actually a minority of socially anxious people who have just a single trigger for their social anxiety. For most people with social anxiety disorder, it's multiple triggers because there are underlying negative core beliefs that they have about themselves of how they come across, not just in one situation, but frequently, how they come across. And those core beliefs are typically connected to strong feelings of shame in addition to anxiety. Shame meaning that they feel in some way deficient, fundamentally deficient in their own self-perception, but also they imagine that they are being perceived as fundamentally deficient to others. So this imagery work, both the first two steps of identifying the present day recurring image, as well as their first remembered experience of that image, the social trauma, in other words, is typically connected to feelings of shame, humiliation, not only anxiety. The third step is then to help the client identify what are the core beliefs that they have. It may be a single belief, it may be a few. What are the core beliefs they have that are connected to, Clark would say, encapsulated by this image, both the present recurring image as well as the remembered social trauma. And there are different ways of coming up with this. Now, I do need to say that in my work, typically we already know the core belief before, because as you're doing the earlier CBT for social anxiety work, people are often telling you their core beliefs even before you ask them that. They'll often say things like, I'm just so socially inept in this situation. And they may be talking about a specific situation, but the belief that they're socially inept is a core belief. Or they may have told you that they believe that their anxiety is visible and will lead others to scorn them, reject them, think badly of them. Well, that's a kind of core belief too. It's a conditional belief, but it's an underlying belief as well. So often you already know the core belief, but just to make sure, after the person describes their imagery, both the present recurring image as well as the social trauma memory image, you would ask them questions like, what's the worst thing about this image or this memory to you? And what does it mean to you? What does it mean about you? And questions like that will help them verbalize their core belief. And again, the core belief might be an absolute statement like, I'm socially inept, or it might be a more conditional belief like, if people see me make social errors, or if people see me appear anxious, they will reject me and think poorly of me. Either way, those are important underlying beliefs that we can determine based on their imagery and the social trauma memory. So those are the first few steps. Then, with their eyes open, and this is why it's important to wait in therapy until they've already gathered positive evidence, you would ask them to describe how are things different for you now versus then being at the time of the social trauma. And I would start with asking them some very basic objective questions like, how old were you then? Well, I was 13. How old are you now? I'm 33, or whatever. How old were the other people you were interacting with then? Well, they were also other 13-year-olds, and now I'm interacting with adults of all ages. So you start with some real basic stuff, and then also ask them, how are people reacting to you then? Well, they were scoffing, they were laughing, they were speaking behind my back to others. And during the course of the experiments you've done in therapy so far, how have people been reacting to you now? And again, by the time that you do this strategy with them, they will have gained a lot of experience through experiments that, well, people are reacting to them at least neutrally and usually positively. And that maybe occasionally there's a brief chuckle, but that's rare. And if there's a brief chuckle, the conversation goes on, nothing bad seems to happen thereafter. So they're able to describe through therapy experiment experience they've had in the previous several weeks or months, a lot of evidence with your guidance of how people are reacting to them differently now than when they first experienced the social trauma. You would also ask him, it doesn't matter exactly what order, but you would also ask the client, how are you handling things differently now versus then, starting with then? So as a child or as an adolescent, they would describe, well, I felt humiliated. I fled the scene as soon as I could. I, wouldn't talk to anybody about this. I avoided interacting with these people as much as I could thereon because I felt so ashamed whenever I saw them. That would be examples of how they reacted then. And then you could ask them, how do you react to situations that make you anxious now? And again, this is another reason why it's important that you don't do this early in therapy. You do it after they've already started making progress. And they'll be able to say things like, well, I've learned to stay in the situation despite my anxiety. I've learned to focus mindfully externally on the conversation itself. And even when I'm very anxious, I realize I could still make conversation. I've learned that by doing so, my anxiety typically goes down. And as I said earlier, people generally react well to me, or at least neutrally to me. And then afterwards, I've learned to affirm myself for the positive things that I experience and not strictly beat myself up for what seemed negative. So again, they're able to elicit how, they're able to explain how they handle situations differently now, both during and afterwards, versus than the way they experienced and handled the situation at the time of their social trauma. Then the homework, and this could go on for weeks, the homework would be for them to do a series of experiments in which there's an additional goal beyond what they've been doing before, which is to look for ways, evidence that things are different now versus then. Specifically, ways that they handle the situation differently now than they did at the time of the social trauma, and also the way people are responding to them differently now versus at the time of the trauma, and to then write these ways down after each experiment. Not during, of course, that would be distracting, but afterwards to write down how things are different now versus then in the way they handled the situation, both during and afterwards, as well as the way other people responded to them. The idea behind this, of course, is training the client to see how things are different now when they are experiencing anxiety and how they are handling situations and how people are reacting to them versus when their negative core beliefs and self-images were created through social trauma. And at subsequent sessions, of course, part of the homework review would be discussing with them the experiments they did and the evidence that they gathered of how things are different then versus now. Now, before I describe the next technique, which is called imagery rescripting, I wanted to see if there are any questions or comments that people had on the material so far.
This is Stephanie. I had one question. So I have somebody that I'm working with right now who has social anxiety. We're at the very beginning of treatment, but anytime she's worried that her big fear is that she's annoying to her friends. And so she does a lot of reassurance seeking. So she asks them if she's annoying. And then when they say no, her response to me is, well, they're just trying to be nice, but I actually am annoying. And so if she was trying to gather that evidence, she wouldn't believe the evidence regardless. So I'm wondering how that, if that kind of feeds into the anxiety as opposed to sitting with that distress and discomfort.
Right. And of course, it's making me smile here, although I realize with the client it could be very painful. Then if she keeps asking for reassurance, that likely will become annoying to the people, and then they notice the annoyance and see, I was annoying. You know, that's the problem with social anxiety, not only in the example that you give, Stephanie, but in general. The thing that we fear when we're socially anxious is, in adulthood anyways, typically invisible. That if we're afraid that people, whether they're going to be annoyed at us or think badly of us in other ways, or have some sort of general bad impression of us or not like us, often a client early in therapy will feel, well, they were just being nice, they're too polite to show it, and so forth. So there's, like with most anxiety problems, maybe all anxiety problems, there is a question of doubt. There is a question of uncertainty and being able to tolerate uncertainty. So this goes back to the earlier work that Clark and others do with social anxiety work, which is when you're planning homework experiments with a client, you would ask them if somebody, you would ask them, first of all, what is your prediction? In this case, that somebody will be annoyed with me. And then you would ask them, if they don't put it in behavioral terms, and that's an example of someone putting it in an emotional term, not a behavioral term, you would ask them, what would that look like if somebody were annoyed with you? And depending on the person, they might say, well, the person might, use certain mannerisms, roll their eyes, or make a sharp, curt comment. They might end the conversation early, something like that. And then you would conduct a series of experiments in which you would test for that, acknowledging with the client that it is possible that the person is feeling annoyed with you, but is not showing any symptoms and is too polite to. But then doing some underlying belief of, then why would that matter? What would that mean to you? If the person is responding to you in a way that appears that they are not annoyed with you, if they are continuing the conversation with you, if they are laughing and seeming to enjoy the conversation with you, why might it matter that deep inside they might be feeling annoyed and just not showing it or something like that? So that's the tough thing about social anxiety compared to other phobias, and why I'm glad that they largely call it social anxiety disorder and not social phobia anymore, is that with other phobias, besides the fact that there usually is no shame basis to other phobias, with other phobias, you usually know right away whether or not the feared outcome is happening. Did the elevator get stuck? Did the plane crash? Did the dog bite? I mean, you usually know that right away. You don't know for sure if it will happen the next time. So it doesn't make phobias really easy to overcome. It takes repeated exposure. But with social anxiety, it's hard to know right away. And so repeated practice in which you help the person put their hot thoughts, their negative predictions in behavioral terms helps. But with some clients, they are so fixated on their belief that people are going to be annoyed with me, even if they don't show it, that it's important to do this sort of imagery work to help them challenge it in that way. Anyone else, any questions or reactions to the then versus now strategy, or the whole idea of social trauma, before I discuss the next strategy. The next strategy he calls imagery rescripting, and you probably know that phrase because it's something that a strategy that's used and has been used for a longer period of time with PTSD. And also, it's my understanding, borderline personality disorder, although I'm not sure how it's used with that, but it's certainly used with rescripting negative imagery through violent or other kinds of sexual or physical traumas associated with PTSD. Clark has adapted it to the social trauma work with social anxiety. It's largely the same strategy as used with PTSD, but he added a stage in the beginning, an introductory stage of cognitive restructuring, of gathering evidence, which is not usually done with imagery rescripting, although it could be, but it's not usually how it's presented. So in Clark's imagery rescripting work, the first stage, as I said, is cognitive restructuring, which is essentially the same as the beginning of the work with the then versus now strategy. In other words, you ask a client to describe a recurring image in the present when they are socially anxious and help them to identify the underlying core belief in that image. So it's done in essentially the same way. At this point, though, we're not using the social traumatic memory yet. We're talking about the recurrent image in the present. So they might say that I appear awkward, I appear anxious, and you would then ask, and other people are reacting negatively to me, either laughing or scoffing or thinking badly of me, even if they're too polite to show it. That might be the recurrent image or recurrent impression, as he calls it, that they have in the present. And then you would ask follow-up questions of what does that say about you as a person, or what's the worst part of that image to you? And that's how you elicit the core belief, which might be I'm socially inept, or I'm so socially awkward that people cannot accept me, that people will see this awkwardness and reject me, things like that. So the first step, of course, is eliciting what the recurrent image is and the underlying core belief. The next step is the cognitive restructuring piece, is again, another reason why you should not be doing this early in therapy until you know there is already evidence to counter this. But you would ask them, based on the experiments that we've done so far, what is the evidence that refutes this belief? Actually, the first step, I'm sorry, that's the second step. The first step is asking them, what's the evidence that supports this belief based on the traumatic experience that you had originally? So they might say that in actuality, people did react this way to me. They did scoff at me. They did speak badly of me to other people. They did start rejecting me and not wanting to deal with me, and it was a very humiliating and shaming experience. And then you would ask them, based on the experiments you've been doing in our work together in therapy, what's the evidence refuting this? And again, just like with the then versus now technique, you would help them elicit that evidence. If they're having a hard time with that, you would bring up specific experiments that they've done. Remember the time you went to the meetup and you were telling me what your experience was like again then. Remind me again, what were the things that you did at the meetup? Well, I said hello to a few people. I had a couple conversations that were a little bit awkward, but nothing bad happened. I had one conversation that started out a little bit awkward, but it ended up being a flowing conversation, and they even gave me their email or something. So you would help remind them of experiments they've done in which you know they've gathered evidence against this core belief, but they might not readily be able to or acknowledge that without your guidance. So those are the initial steps of gathering evidence to refute the core belief, that they've gathered through therapy in the present versus the evidence from the social trauma that they experienced earlier in their lives that seems to support the core beliefs. The next stage is the actual imagery rescripting, which is divided into 3 stages. The first stage, and this is done with their eyes closed, is to have them describe the experience of the social trauma, the first time they had this image of themselves, and to have them describe it in first person and in present tense, again, as if it were happening now. And again, some people see these images very vividly in pictorial fashion in their mind's eye. Other people not, but still, if they describe it in detail, like an author of a novel might describe a scene in detail, if they narrate it in detail, it's likely to evoke emotion, even if their mind's eye is completely blank. It's still a type of imagery, even though it's not visualization imagery. So again, the first stage of this rescripting itself is to have them describe the social trauma in first person present tense, just like you do within the then versus now technique. Here's where it gets different. The second stage is they re-describe the trauma, but this time as a third person outsider. So imagine that as their adult self. So let's say the image happened at 13, the original social trauma that is, and their adult self is say 33. You would have them describe it as their adult self observing the image. So it would be in third person present tense, still present tense, but third person. So I see that Sally is doing this. You know, you would describe yourself as a narrator of a book might, you know, in third person. And I see that the other people are responding to her in this way, and they would describe it in detail. The purpose of moving from first person to third person, or from the person experiencing the trauma to a person observing it, is to begin to be able to detach emotionally from it, and to be able to observe it more more objectively. Now, in that second stage, you're simply asking them to describe the social trauma, not to intervene yet. Some clients may already start intervening as their adult self, in which case he suggests that you let them go with that and see where it takes you. Essentially what they're doing is blurring what is planned as stage 2 with stage 3, but that's okay. You don't want to correct them, but in giving them directions for stage 2, you're just asking them to describe the image again, the memory again, but this time from an observer point of view. The third stage is they go back to re-describing the original social trauma as the participant, as the person who experienced it in first person, present tense still, but this time they have their adult self by their side. And the adult self can intervene verbally or behaviorally in any ways that the client chooses. This is usually the longest stage in imagery rescripting, and this is where the rescripting itself happens. Rescripting essentially being cognitive restructuring, but done in imagery form rather than the usual verbal form of traditional cognitive restructuring. So for example, the person would be describing again the trauma, the social trauma they experienced again in first person present tense, but their adult self would be by their side, and you would ask occasional questions, unless the client is doing this on their own, like, what would you like your adult self to do? How would you like your adult you to support you, to help you, perhaps to intervene? And people will come up with very different answers. In some cases, the adult self may be providing information and sort of guidance and support and counseling and compassion. So it may be that the adult self says something like, these people are just being immature, that you're just a normal kid, and any normal kid experiences an embarrassing moment from time to time, and that someday they'll grow out of their immaturity, hopefully, but it's important that you not take it personally. It's about them, not you. So that would be an example of the adult self intervening by providing compassion and understanding and a kind of counseling. In some cases, the client may want their adult self to intervene. So the adult self may come in and berate the kids that are laughing at the younger client and say, you're being mean, you're being immature, you don't want people to treat you this way, so why would you treat them that way? I mean, different clients will want different things, but you're asking the client, still with their eyes closed, describing their imagery, what would you like to happen here? How would you like the adult you to help you out here? After they answer that question, before ending the imagery, chances are there's more. And so to check if there's more, you would ask the question something like, is there anything else that you want to happen? Is there anything else that you need or want to do or say here? And at some point they'll say no, but often there will be a series of things that they want to do. It's not only their adult self who is intervening. It might be that they want to be able to, as their child self, stand up to the bully if they were bullied, and to be able to intervene themselves directly. Or they might want to be able to respond to them afterwards and to say, that was really mean what you did to me. I would never treat you that way. Why did you treat me this way? Might want to be able to assert themselves afterwards with the people that had been ridiculing them or something. So again, in the third stage, you're asking them to re-describe the image in first person, but this time asking them, what would you like to happen here? What do you need to do or say here? What do you want the adult you to do for you here? Then after the imagery is done, of course, you would process it with the client. One thing I forgot to say earlier in the very beginning stage before the imagery begins, but when you elicit the core belief, you would ask them at this point, how strongly do you believe the core belief? And they might say, I believe it 90%, the core belief being that I'm socially inept, and if people see me be awkward, they will reject me. And then at the end of imagery, the end of the rescripting, with their eyes open and you're asking them how they feel, how it went for them, their general impressions. One of the things you would ask them, not usually the first question, but later, is, oh, by the way, what is your belief now in this? How strongly do you believe this idea that you are socially inept now, and that if people see your awkwardness, they will humiliate you and reject you? And typically, of course, their belief rating goes down. It's not going to go down to 0 at that point, but it's likely to go down noticeably. And then you would ask them, what do they make of that? You believe this earlier more strongly, and we did this imagery rescripting, and still believe it, but less so now. What do you make of that? And different people, of course, will have different answers, but often what they will say is something like, well, maybe that's what I believed a lot when I was a teenager, but now I'm beginning to see that things aren't quite the same as they are now, but I'm not entirely sure. So again, it ties in with the whole then versus now thing, but you're doing it by attempting to rescript their memory of the social trauma in a way that counters their core belief and takes into account the positive evidence that they've been gathering through therapy. Now, so this is the second technique. The other thing I would want to say about that is Clark emphasizes that he uses the then versus now, the first technique, with nearly all of his socially anxious clients. And there's a very good, if you haven't watched it already, there's a very good maybe 10-minute video of that being used. I think it's a role-played video, but it's still a very good demonstration of it being used in session. And then if you want more information on the imagery rescripting, there's not a video, but there is an article in which he describes it in depth which we also sent to you and will be linked on the website. He stresses that he uses the then versus now with nearly all of his clients, but again, after they've started making some progress through experiments and through external mindfulness training. The imagery rescripting, he generally only does with people who are sort of getting stuck in therapy, who've done a number of experiments, who are gathering evidence, refuting their old core beliefs, but it doesn't seem to be taking for them. It's not sinking in. Like the example Stephanie gave earlier, the person is gathering evidence, but they're not believing it. So using imagery rescripting for people like that who objectively seem to be making progress, but on an emotional level don't seem to be making progress, imagery rescripting might be really helpful for them. So that's that. Does anyone have any further questions or comments or cases that they would want to bring up in a anonymous way, of course, applying these techniques with? One thing that I would add is imagery rescripting and the stimulus discrimination training, then versus now, are only two of the techniques that can be used to help clients change their socially anxious core beliefs. It's the ones that are most specifically related to social trauma and changing the imagery of social trauma. But I would want to encourage you to do the sort of age-old, or not really age-old, but decades-old CBT strategies of carrying out experiments specifically to test their core beliefs. So this goes beyond Clark's work, but since we have a little bit of time, I just want to mention briefly, you can conduct experiments later in therapy in which you're not testing just the automatic thought, you know, that I'm going to appear anxious and people will reject me, but you're also testing the underlying core belief that I'm socially inept and people observing any deficiency in my social interaction will reject me. You could design experiments to test the underlying core belief as well. It could be through I call it rebel experiments, in which you identify the rules based on your old core beliefs, which might be, I'll avoid talking to people at length. I'll keep my comments very short. I'll avoid initiating conversation with people. I will ask lots of questions to keep the focus on the other person rather than on myself. And then the kind of experiments that you can use to test the core belief is by purposely breaking those rules. I call those rebel experiments, rebelling against those rules, doing essentially the opposite of that. I will talk more about myself. I will initiate conversation more. Or it could be paradoxical experiments or shame attacking experiments, they're sometimes called. You know, I will purposely flub up a sentence every now and then or make a mistake every now and then to see how the person reacts. And typically they either don't notice at all or maybe they chuckle briefly, but the conversation goes on totally unaffected. So there's a whole series of behavioral experiments that one could conduct to challenge core beliefs in addition to the imagery work that Clark does. And another way to approach those experiments are called act as if experiments, the phrase coming, I believe, originally from Alcoholics Anonymous, although it's not specific to alcohol or substance use disorders at all. Act as if as applied to CBT would mean doing experiments in which you are acting as if you fully believe the healthy alternative core belief that you will have developed in therapy by that time. So if their healthy alternative core belief is that you know, I am adequately socially skilled. It doesn't have to be that they're charismatic. It could be I'm adequately socially skilled, and as long as I'm focused reasonably mindfully on the conversation, that most people will react very positively to me, even if I'm occasionally awkward. If something like that is their healthy alternative core belief that they devise, then they could do a series of experiments in which they act as if they believe that core belief fully. And you would help them identify behaviorally, what does that mean? It might mean I would initiate conversation. I would speak more about myself. I would purposely say more personal things about myself that might be a little bit vulnerable if the conversation is going well, to gather evidence of how people react to me and respond. So those are all examples of behavioral experiments you can do that challenge the core beliefs that we learn through social trauma, but they don't directly challenge the images or the memories of the traumas themselves, whereas Clark's then versus now strategy and imagery rescripting strategy directly challenge and try to modify those images as well. That's all that I have to present. Does anyone have any questions or reactions or cases they would like to discuss in this regard? Okay, well, thank you.
Larry, thank you very much. We really appreciate you taking the time and effort to make this presentation today. I want to remind everyone that this will be up on the NSAC website, and I'm not sure if it will be published on the ADAA website, but will be available at some point in the future if you would like to listen to it again. And we will be meeting next month on the 4th Tuesday of the month at noon Central. Let me just double check the